Hi everyone, I am 𝐤𝐬𝐧𝐭𝐤𝐬, the business editor at the Africa Report. Many thanks for joining us today for our webinar on how can climate finance expand electricity access in Africa. Many of us know that still today, 70% of the population lacks access to reliable electricity. And if we hope to close this gap via climate financing, finance that aims to reduce emissions, enhance sinks of greenhouse gases, with an aim of increasing Africa's ability to overcome the impact of climate change, then Africa needs to attract much more than the 3% of the total amount of global climate finance that it does today. Exploring how we can close this gap will be the main topic of discussion for our webinar today. But before we get into all of that, I'd like to remind our audience of the upcoming Africa Financial Industry Summit, which will be taking place in Lomé this year, between the 28th and 29th of November. I hope that you will be able to join us there. And also, if you would like to learn a bit more about the topics discussed during this webinar, we invite you to download our brand new report entitled 6 Key Recommendations on Climate Finance for African Growth. And you should be able to see the link in the chat function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And again, just before we start, some housekeeping. Please, if you've got any questions for the panelists, you can submit them into the Q&A box, again, towards the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to address them towards the end of the webinar. We'll also introduce 2 polls with multiple choice answers, which we would love for you guys to participate in. And now, let me please introduce to you our esteemed panelists. We have firstly 𝐜𝐴𝐬𝐧𝐭𝐤𝐬, the CEO of the Gabonese Sovereign Wealth Fund, Lena Osman, Head of Sustainable Finance West at Standard Chartered. We have 𝐩𝐫𝐴𝐬𝐭, Vice President for Africa at the IFC, and 𝐷𝐸𝐿, Vice President Global Hydrogen Development at Total Eren. We also have a very special guest speaker with us today, His Excellency Jean-Luc Assy, Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development for Côte d'Ivoire. And he'll be taking part in a special Q&A later on in the programme. But before that, I would like to introduce you to Marie-France Reynaud, economist at Philae Advisory, with our expert presentation. So take it away, Marie-France.
Thanks a lot, 𝐜𝐴𝐬𝐧𝐭𝐤𝐬. Hello, everybody. I'm Marie-France Reynaud, and I'm honored and humbled to introduce this panel discussion on climate finance and electricity access in Africa. So climate finance appears like a potential tsunami to meet, as you see on the graph, to meet the 2-degree scenario, annual flows should more than double by 2030. And to reach the safer 1.5 scenario, they should be multiplied by 6. And this could happen in light of the increasing government, financial institutions, private companies' commitments to a carbon neutrality target, which is a proxy of the 1.5 scenario. So what does it mean for electricity access in Africa, which has deteriorated over the last years despite the Sustainable Development Goals commitments? That means that billions of financial flows could be redirected to specific adaptation and mitigation sectors and easily meet the annual financing needs for universal access to electricity in Africa, estimated up to $25 billion. Next slide, please. But currently, what we see is that Africa attracts only 3% of climate finance, as 𝐜𝐴𝐬𝐧𝐭𝐤𝐬 said, despite its highest solar potential worldwide, despite its highest land carbon sequestration capacity, especially with the basin of Congo, and despite the fact that the region is the most vulnerable to climate change. The data shows as well that, in stark contrast to other regions, public climate financing is more than 8 times higher than private climate financing. And despite huge potential, so actual and perceived risks remain high in Africa for the private sector. Next slide. Public financing, mainly provided by DFIs, mainly in the form of loans, and by governments, mainly in the form of grants, are key to overcome initial barriers, but they are scarce. The good news is that public financing can crowd in more private investment. In that respect, at project levels, guarantees which are less distributed are recognized to have the strongest leverage effect on private investment. For $1 provided by a public institution, they crowd in the largest share of private financing. Guarantees have indeed strong mitigation benefits on political risks and also on the offtake risk, which is deterrent for independent power producer. More generally, blended finance vehicles can catalyze at scale large-size investors in geographies that are usually outside their remits, with DFI rebalancing risk-rewarding profiles of investment in providing first-loss tranches, for example. Next slide. In order to attract private financing, there is also an interesting instrument to look at, which has been nascent for some years. I mean the carbon credits. A carbon credit is an asset that values the avoidance, the reduction or absorption of 1 ton of CO2 equivalent greenhouse emission, be it in the energy sector or in the forestry sector. Buyers use it for compensating their own unavoidable emissions. Carbon markets are decentralized. You have the regulated ones like the European carbon trade market, and you have the voluntary ones, which are generally over the counter. These markets are more and more interrelated, even more with the new Article 6, and they share the same taxonomy, they share the same certifiers, and the same double counting headache. Despite Africa's huge potential in carbon credits generation in the renewable sector, but also in the forestry sector, it has only generated 2% of the total, in stark contrast to Asia, mainly India and China. Globally, if we look at African countries' NDC and their global annual mitigation target by 2030, we can estimate the carbon credit supply in the renewable sector at some millions a year by 2030. So if you have a strong potential supply, you need a demand, and a demand at a fair price, and that's the next slide. The demand is not really an issue. According to studies, the demand for carbon credits could reach 1 billion a year by 2030. But among the multiple entry barriers for project developers in Africa to generate carbon credits, the lengthy certification process, the identification of the buyer, the difficulty to integrate carbon credits in the business plan, the prices is the main issue. Over the last years on the voluntary markets, carbon credits have been traded between $1 and $15, and there is a discrepancy among sectors. But if we look at the regulated market, you see that on the graph, and at the recommendations made by the International Panel on Climate Change, no doubt that the price should consistently increase for African projects, including in light of the many sustainable development goals co-benefits they generate. So all in all, the supply of carbon credits in the renewable energy sector could provide some billions of fresh capital each year, but it should be even more in the forestry sector. I think that 𝐤𝐴𝐳𝐬𝐴 might touch upon that a bit later. So what's up for COP27? Next slide. The African group of negotiators pushed for an integrated approach to the climate crisis, promoting a resilient, low-carbon development path. Each word counts. So that means more financing on adaptation. That means also the necessity of tying development benchmarks like energy security to climate goals. In that respect, Africa requests more institutional and human capacity building to harness the Article 6 carbon finance mechanism in order to fully value its strong mitigation potential. But to conclude with, if we look at the current 100 billion climate finance pledge made by developed countries toward developing countries, it fell short by almost 20 billions. And this is because of insufficient private contributions. But to attract private investment beyond the DFI effort to crowd in private investor we mentioned before, there might be some homework for African governments to fill in the investment gap in the electricity sector, like developing a realistic planning based on strong technical studies and comprehensive regulation, including tariffs and licenses in the on-grid, IPP, and off-grid sector. So I'm really looking forward to hear what the panel has to say on that. Many thanks.
Thank you, Marie-France, for that presentation. I think it's really helped to set the scene for today's discussion. But before we get into that, I think this would be a good time to introduce our poll. So the question we have for our audience, which I hope will resonate with them, is how do you think we can attract more private capital to fund Africa's electrification goals? So this is a multiple choice poll. The first answer we have is through blended finance tools. Second is through better upstream project preparation. Third, by maximising the potential of carbon credits. Fourth, through green bonds. And fifth, by reducing political and regulatory risks. So please cast your votes and we'll get back to the poll results shortly. And with that, I'd like to get straight into today's theme. So we heard from Marie-France that Africa will need a financial tsunami if it's going to reach its target of maintaining global warming to 1.5 degrees, as outlined in the Paris Agreement. And meanwhile, compared to other regions, Africa relies heavily on public sector funding and lacks the private funding required to meet the goal. So Sergio, I'd like to address the first question to you, if that's okay. In your view, I mean, what role do development finance institutions play in accelerating climate smart finance in Africa, and how do they help mobilise the private sector to take part as well?
Thank you very much, Kanika. These are very, very good questions, and I think the ones that you also ask in the poll give some of the indications of the directions that we should be working on as DFIs and as all the partners that are involved in the development of Africa through having more contribution from the private sector. I think it's there's a few points that I would make there in terms of what is needed, and I would not follow the sequence of your poll, but I would mention those that I think both Marie-France and the poll have referred to. First, I mean, there are some challenges that we need to look at. I mean, there's a need for a significant increase on funding, and this funding will require not just public funding, but a lot of private sector funding. So I think when you want to attract private sector, there's several actions need to be taken in parallel. It's not just one that will help get the solution there. I think working on the regulatory environment is important so that you facilitate having more access to private sector funding for climate smart projects in the energy sector and across Africa. I think the second part, which is important, is this issue of finding bankable projects. And as of today, we continue saying, because we continue seeing that there are not enough bankable projects in Africa that private sector can come and contribute to. And this is why, I mean, on the IFC side, we've been really focusing a lot on what we call this upstream work. And upstream is not upstream gas, it's upstream meaning working early on projects or working on opportunities and finding ways of creating projects, creating new markets, new opportunities, where then the partners can come in, private sector can come in, can bring its expertise, its capital, its knowledge, and DFIs can support and so can other institutions and partners. So having that focus on creating new opportunities is extremely important. Now, even when we do this, we realize that very often the risk remains still too high. So in order for those projects to be bankable and to be able to move forward, that's where we can use blended finance, where we can sort of de-risk some of these projects. On the IFC side, we use mostly the IDA private sector window that has been put together a few years ago, and that has been very effective in helping attract more private sector to Africa. Yeah. And then I'll stop here, but I think also bringing in new instruments like that you've already mentioned is going to be very important, including green bonds and so on. But thank you.
So Sergio, you mentioned a few things there, the regulatory environment, bankable projects, working on opportunities early on. So, the upstream aspect of that and creating new markets. So Lina, like I say, Sergio mentions a lot of these issues, but perhaps you could elaborate further on the types of products that are out there to encourage kind of more collaboration between the public and private sectors to get the private sector on board.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kanika. And I think that's a really good kind of segue into that topic. So I think there are several types of products that we have been seeing and that have been already in the market. But what's really more important, including what we just spoke about in terms of the green, green bonds, green loans, the social products as well, but more importantly as well, the transition finance side of things, and focusing a little bit more on that, especially in the context of Africa. Now, in terms of how we can do more of those things, I think it's not just doing those, but also keeping in mind innovating around different structures that are, again, tailor-made for Africa, tailor-made for the continent, that addresses its challenges, and is aligned with the continent's objectives as well, where you want to transition, but you also want to go through an economical and just transition in order to ensure that you continue to grow as countries, but also.
Oh, Lina, I think we might have lost you. No. Oh, such a shame, Lina. Well, hopefully we'll get you back soon. But I think we do have enough there, because I think you mentioned, kind of economic and just transition. So how do you finance an economic and just transition, and what kind of objectives do African countries have for that end? And so, 𝐜𝐸, it'd be great to bring you in here, because it'd be great to talk a little bit about your your tangible experience around working with the private sector to encourage climate finance, to work towards this goal of 1.5 degrees, and even, and this goal of an economic and just transition for African states. So please, it'd be great, 𝐜𝐸.
Thank you very much, Kanika, for this question. And I believe I will build on what Sergio has already started indicating. When we look at especially the objective of the 1.5 degrees, and we look at the various sectors that are in terms of greenhouse gas emission, we see that the energy sector is the fastest growing one. So, but at the same time, when we look at the number of the amount that is needed to build sustainably, we reach trillions of dollars. And obviously, public sector alone will not be able to do it. So countries has to have strong regulatory framework in place, to a conducive regulatory framework, so that we can attract private sector, so that they can come in, bring innovation and the capital. And also, what could be also help do faster is having instruments such as sovereign wealth fund, who can work into de-risking the project at the early stage. But also that can be local partners for foreign direct investors. Therefore, we can have a local partner who has an understanding of the regulatory framework and also have access. Like I like to say, I share the sleepless nights with my partners when we work on a project. So we have skin in the game. So we have a total alignment. And by doing that, also what we succeeded in doing is freeing up some budgetary space for the government, because before the government had to invest 100% of the cost of an infrastructure. I will quickly give an example. We're currently constructing an hydro dam here in Gabon, a 30 megawatt hydro dam. It's a 180 million euros investment. before, the government would have had to do painful arbitrage between either investing in that critical infrastructure that is needed for the economy and the people, or investing in sectors such as healthcare or education. But now with PPPs and the capacity to attract investors, and having investors such as Meridiam that are partners in that project, and development financial institutions such as IFC and AFDB who brought the senior debt, now the government through the Sovereign Wealth Fund is only investing 12% of the cost of the infrastructure. Because at the end of the day, no government should have to choose between building the infrastructure that it needs for its development or preserving the environment. Yeah. And the reality, when you look at this quickly on this one, when you look at the 𝐤𝐵𝐵 hydro dam, by 2040, we will avoid more than 1.3 million tons of emissions.
Yeah. I mean, I think you raised a few really interesting key points there, actually. So, you know, it's all well and good having all those products in place, but PPs, it's like you say, you need to be in it together to be able to create space for the government to be able to work on other things as well. Tariq, great to bring you in here because, you know, I think you have an interesting viewpoint, maybe working previously for the public sector and now in the private sector. And so how have you seen that kind of collaboration between public and private evolve to mobilise climate finance?
Thank you very much, Ania, for the introduction and for the invitation. Yeah, I mean, as was saying before by you, by Hakim, for sure the demand is there in Africa. More than 50% of the population has no access to electricity, and even the one that has access, the consumption is very few comparing to what is needed in terms of development. And right now, most of the project that has been developed in the power sectors was done by the public sector, so involving the guarantee from the states, through also the support of DFIs, but of course requesting such kind of guarantee. This is of course a limitation. On the other hand, we have the problem of the bankability of the project. We discussed it, and I think I will not highlight it more. But for sure, if we want to enhance the capacity of financing the project, we have to team up private and public. And right today in Africa, let's say only less than 15% of the investment of the sector has been done by the private, where 85% from the public. Yeah. If we comparing to what is the case in Europe, almost 99% of investment is done by the private sector. So for sure, we have to team up and find a way to do it. And here we have an example we developed in the past. For sure, the public has to work on implementing the appropriate legal framework to give enough security regarding the offtake, and also to mobilize a kind of specific financing. You mentioned the collaboration between private sector, where the public can be shareholder on the project, bringing a portion of the capital. We have many examples we developed in Morocco, for example, on the solar project and on the wind project. We were mobilizing the financing from the FIs and transferring this financing to the private in order to de-risk the project, especially during the construction period. And also we take share on it. So it's a kind also of support to the project. On the other hand, you mentioned the green bond, which is an interesting financing that can be also guaranteed by the state through local currency, which also can enhance the capacity of financing and catch the private sector.
Yeah, there's lots of kind of solutions on the table there. Let's just go back to Lina now that we have you back. You know, if you wanted to finish up what you were saying, I think you were abruptly cut off before we go.
I'm so sorry. Thank you. So sorry about that. So I was just talking a little bit about the innovation in the structures that we could potentially bring to the market. And I think even if we get into blended finance, which is one of the things that we've been talking about, but also that was part of the poll, is the different instruments within blended finance, because blended finance is not just guarantees; it's also different structures that could come in that could support a project. From technical assistance, for example, for a project to take off, all the way to different types of structures that could come in, including first loss, for example, subordinated debt, or different types of guarantees and ideas that you can bring into the structure in order to encourage the private sector to come into these transactions.
Great. Thank you so much, Lina. I think we've covered a lot of ground there. We can see that there's a lot of potential for change. There's a lot of products and opportunities out there that we can leverage. And I think, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that develops over the years. Before we get into the next discussion point, I think we hopefully have the poll results ready. Do we have the poll results ready? Anyone? No? Okay. Well, maybe we
Yes, Kanika. Could you please check your chat box? I think you received the poll.
Let me just see. Aha. Yes, here we go. So the results are in. So how do you think we can attract more private capital to fund Africa's electrification goals? So with 33% of the vote, we have a reducing political and regulatory risk. With 26%, we have through blended finance tools. Then 18% we have by maximising the potential of carbon credits. With 14% through better upstream project preparation, and then with 9% only through green bonds. So I mean, I think it reflects kind of broadly what our panelists have discussed, you know, the blended finance and reducing the political and regulatory risks are way up there. So it seems like our audience and our panelists are in agreement. But now it'd be great to move on in the panel discussion. And again, going back to Marie-France's presentation, we can see that there's an opportunity now to leverage carbon credits as an asset class in Africa. And I guess they can be used to both offset CO2 emissions and provide additional sources of financing for necessary investments in decarbonised growth. There still seems like there's some way to go, as Marie-France pointed out, but I guess I wonder how we can maximise that potential going forward. So Ky, maybe we can start with you again. I know that Gabon, I think it's planning to sell 2 billion worth of carbon credits before COP27. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but it would be great to know a little bit more about kind of the process involved in that and what the benefits will be for Gabon.
Very interesting. This is exciting times for Gabon. But let me say something first. What we're seeing today is the result of decades of reliable, sustainable, deliberate, and courageous groundbreaking policy that have been put in place by the successive government of the country. Let me just name a few of them. In 2006, we put 12% of the country under protected reserve through a network of 13 national parks. In 2010, we banned the export of raw logs, and we created an agency for the observation of the forest through spatial observation. And finally, we have a sustainable development law that entails that only one tree is cut every hectares every 25 years. Why I said courageous? Because when a country that is a timber exporter decide to ban the export of raw logs, it means that you walk away from revenues because the first years, the operators have now to move from straight log traders to industrials. But we knew that doing that at the time will help us reap the benefit further down the road. And this is where we are now, because we were able to capture a larger part of the value creation for our economy. We were able to upskill the workers and improve their livelihood and protect the forest, because by doing that, we were able to reduce our deforestation rate to less than 1%. And that's why Gabon today, we have 88% of the territory that is covered by forest. But by reducing those deforestation rate, we were able between 2010 and 2018 to constitute this stock of 90 million tons of carbon credits that are currently under the last round of UNFCCC certification. We're confident that this 90 million tons of carbon will be issued before the next COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. And last week, during the Africa Climate Week, the Sovereign Wealth Fund was entrusted with being the monetizing agent of those carbon credits. Yeah. So with some of our landmark partners, we will in the coming weeks launch a price discovery initiative. Since this carbon credit will be the first of the kind to come on the market, they're coming with the highest level of integrity, since coming from a country that is a net absorber, so there's no risk of leakage or greenwashing. So we're really looking forward to that, because it will support the transition of Gabon of moving from a fossil-based economy to a natural biocircular economy. Just to conclude on what will be the impact for Gabon, this amount will be invested in biodiversity trust fund. We'll be financing NGOs. We finance the country debt and finance the sovereign wealth fund, so that we can continue developing climate resilience infrastructures.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, it just sounds like there are just numerous benefits to leveraging carbon credits, and you mentioned a few of them. You know, the value creation, upscaling workers, saving the forest being one of them as well, and obviously using those funds to invest. Tarek, I mean, what has your experience been in kind of selling carbon credits, and maybe now with your new hat on, you know, working in an IPP, how might they benefit in the future as well?
Yeah, I mean, it has been said before, one of the issues we faced last decade with the carbon credit is the volatility of the price, and the price was quite low, between $1 and something. But during the last 2-3 years, we see that the price coming back interesting. So this is also pushing the IPPs, but also the public sector in order to monetize this credit carbon. And I did few operation on that. One of the main challenge, of course, is the certification. That the process takes time, and you have to invest on it. There is, of course, many certificators, but I mean, you have to take this in consideration. And when it's done, I think it's after 1-2 years, because sometimes it takes time, 2 years in order to get the certification, of course, and then you face the market. But for sure, during the last decade, we're looking at it as an upside for the project. It wasn't basically integrated on the business plan of the project, and it wasn't considered as a kind of financing of the project, where now we are starting to consider it as a kind of source of financing. So it will enhance and, of course, make the bankability of project more interesting. So for sure, this will be a kind of revenue interesting for the project in the next year, and we have to enhance this operation on different projects. You are in mute, I think.
I'm on mute, so I just realised. I just wanted to bring you in, Lina, just in this at this point as well, because to kind of move on a little bit. But I guess what I'm interested in hearing from you is kind of, you know, we've seen, and I think we've kind of touched on it a little bit in the presentation as well. But we've seen the emergence of carbon markets, and so maybe I thought you could maybe explain a little bit more about how they do work. You know, is there currently a global standard that the voluntary and more formal markets adhere to? But yeah, what kind of, where are we in that development?
So I think, I mean, the way that these carbon markets now work is based on certain methodologies. So there are certain established methodologies in calculating these credits. There are obviously the certifications that Tarek has just touched upon, and those are quite detailed. There, the due diligence that goes into it, and even the development, the project development as well before that is quite time consuming, but very important in order to ensure that everything is basically in place for us to be able to kind of sell these carbon credits. And the thing is, like with carbon credits at the moment with the voluntary market, is that it's there has to be price discoveries, there has to be discussions with different sectors, different organizations, different even countries, depending on who's doing what and why is this important for them and why they're buying it as well. So kind of figuring that out, that price discovery piece is really important, because it will be able to kind of shed a lot of light on what the next steps are. And part of that price discovery is also understanding of what buyers are looking for, what their requirements are, and putting in a kind of a structure from a legal perspective, but also from a sales perspective, because the implications that come after that are quite important. It allows the seller of these carbon credits to kind of either monetize them if they're contractual, or use that funding for even more sustainable projects, and therefore create this virtuous cycle. One really important point to highlight is that there isn't really a set of global standards or rules at the moment that have to be followed. However, there's a lot of work that's being done by the Integrity Council for scaling voluntary carbon markets in order to specifically develop the right principles for the voluntary carbon market, and to ensure any greenwashing risks are appropriately mitigated, any concerns that the market could raise are being addressed and mitigated as well. And that's kind of how how we are seeing this evolve, and I think it will continue to evolve and develop even further the more that we see of these credits coming into the market.
Great, thanks, Lina. I think it would be great to bring you in here, Sergio, because Lina talks about price discovery, discussions with stakeholders, the legal issues. I mean, what do you think still needs to be done, and how can the IFC kind of support the development of the markets, and how make sure that Africa benefits from the prices that we're seeing and hopefully increases too?
Look, I agree. This is a very important topic, and I see a very big opportunity to unlock more financing and unlock more opportunities through the development of carbon markets. I think the example of Gabon, and I'm really glad that Kim could give us such an interesting perspective of it. The example of Gabon in Africa is really one that we should all applaud and congratulate to. I mean, it's been a work over many years to really build a new opportunities to bring in new financing, and what Gabon is reaching a stage now where indeed this is starting to pay off, but it has been a long-term investment. And I think what we all need to do is to learn from that example and try and see how we can accelerate that in other countries. I mean, Marie-France said at the beginning, rightly so, that Africa is still behind Asia or Latin America in terms of the size of the carbon markets that exist, and the opportunities are extremely important in Africa. So we should really try and accelerate the usage of these markets. I think on the DFI side, your question about what we can do and what IFC can do, I think we can pioneer a certain number of examples. We can launch new opportunities, new initiatives. I think we've been working, Tarek was mentioning the certification. We've been working on a newly created distributable renewable energy certificate that will allow to create a new market. We hope to launch this year, and I think this could really help. And then, I mean, since quite a few years now, we have been present in this market. And if I can give one example, we've launched in Kenya a few years ago the very first forest bond, where actually the investors get paid back the interest either in cash or in carbon credits. So it's this type of new instruments that can be developed, and that's what we want to do, work with all the partners around the panel and out there to develop more of these carbon markets.
Yeah, I think the development of it's very nascent at the moment. So I think we'll all be watching to see how it develops and see if there are any initiatives that come out in the upcoming COP too. But at this stage, I would like to introduce His Excellency Jean-Luc Assy, Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development for Côte d'Ivoire. We are extremely pleased that you are able to join us today. Welcome, Minister. I will go straight into my first question, if that's okay. So, according to Côte d'Ivoire's nationally determined contributions, I think they were published around March this year. Your financing needs for adaptation and mitigation are around $22 billion. So, I guess I wanted to know, what is the contribution of climate finance in your resource mobilisation strategy? And what roles do you think that the international financial institutions will play in all of this?
Bien. Bon, merci, mesdames et messieurs les participants. Je ne sais pas si tout le monde comprend français, hein, mais bon, je suis obligé de m'exprimer en français. Voilà. OK. Alors, on a parlé des contributions déterminées au niveau national. Alors, ce qu'il faut retenir, c'est qu'il y a 22 milliards donc, de dollars que nous avons estimés donc, pour la mise en œuvre donc, de nos NDC. L'État ne peut apporter que 11 milliards, donc il y a un gap de 11 milliards donc, de dollars. Vous voyez bien que le budget de l'État est insuffisant donc, pour couvrir les besoins de la mise en œuvre donc, de nos CDN en Côte d'Ivoire. Alors, il est évident donc, de recourir à d'autres mécanismes. Il y a d'autres mécanismes, il faut recourir donc, à d'autres mécanismes de financement. Notamment, on peut noter donc, la finance climatique. Il y a aussi le secteur privé donc, qui peut être intéressé par le financement de la mise en œuvre de nos CDN, les emprunts obligataires verts et les institutions financières internationales. Alors, au plan national, il faut noter qu'il y a un plan d'investissement qui est en cours de finalisation, qui va nous permettre d'ajuster nos coûts et les contributions. Donc, d'autres réflexions donc, sont en cours. Alors, ces réflexions portent essentiellement sur l'instauration d'un prix carbone, la création d'un fonds national climat et l'intégration aussi des changements climatiques dans la budgétisation et la planification nationale afin d'accroître donc la mobilisation financière nationale. Alors, voilà pour la première question, ce qu'on peut donc répondre à.
Great. We can move on to the second question. So, as outlined at COP26, Côte d'Ivoire is committed to reducing its greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by the end of the decade. So I guess I'd be curious to know what progress has been made thus far.
Alors, la Côte d'Ivoire, donc, dans le cadre donc, de ces CDN, comme vous l'avez dit tout à l'heure, avait fixé donc, ses ambitions à 28,25%. Et ces ambitions étaient revues à la hausse. C'est passé donc de 28% donc à 30,41%. À l'horizon, bien sûr, 2030. Hein. Alors, ce qui s'explique par les nombreux efforts et les programmes multisectoriels. Alors, les secteurs qui ont été impactés donc, par tous ces efforts, notamment, donc, on peut citer au niveau de l'énergie, il y a eu un accroissement des énergies renouvelables dans le mix énergétique, donc qui est passé donc de 42% à 45%. Il y a aussi donc le retrait du charbon. Vous savez, le charbon, on en a parlé longuement. Tous les pays donc, tendent à abandonner donc, le charbon. Et donc la Côte d'Ivoire est dans cette dynamique. Donc la Côte d'Ivoire aussi a retiré donc, le charbon du mix énergétique au profit donc, du gaz naturel, qui émet moins de gaz à effet de serre. Au niveau donc, du transport, la Côte d'Ivoire donc est en train de mettre en place donc un certain nombre de projets qui devraient permettre donc d'accroître la proportion des véhicules électriques, avec un objectif bien sûr de 10% du parc automobile. Contre en moins, aujourd'hui nous sommes autour de moins de 1%, donc des véhicules électriques, et donc nous comptons atteindre un objectif de 10%. D'ici, bien sûr, d'ici 2030. Et donc, il y a un projet donc, qui adresse donc, cette question, qui est financé par le FEM, bien sûr. Alors, au niveau du transport, toujours, il y a la mise en œuvre donc, du renouvellement du parc automobile à travers l'utilisation des véhicules aux normes Euro 6, d'ici 2030 aussi, pour tous les véhicules particuliers, les véhicules de transport et puis les véhicules utilitaires. Au niveau de la foresterie, vous savez que la Côte d'Ivoire a abrité donc la COP15 tout dernièrement, et donc la forte recommandation qui est ressortie donc de cette COP15 au niveau de la Côte d'Ivoire, qui a fait ressortir donc ce qu'on appelle l'initiative d'Abidjan, le Legacy Programme, dans lequel donc il a été adressé donc la question forestière, et donc il y a donc un vaste programme donc de reforestation, et donc qui va permettre donc de réduire la déforestation de 200 000 hectares à 30 000 hectares, avec pour objectif donc de réduire le taux de déforestation de 70% à l'horizon bien sûr de 2030 par rapport au niveau de 2015 qui est aujourd'hui donc de 2015 qui était de 200 000 hectares. Aujourd'hui nous sommes arrivés à 30 000 hectares de déforestation. On a réussi donc à réduire donc cette déforestation. Mais à l'horizon 2030, l'objectif c'est de reforester de 1 million d'hectares d'ici 2030. Mais avec des ressources supplémentaires, on pourrait donc l'étendre et arriver donc à 3 millions d'hectares d'ici 2030. Au niveau donc des déchets, alors au niveau des déchets, il y a certaines actions donc, qui sont en cours, mais ce qu'il faut retenir, c'est qu'il y a la construction d'un centre de valorisation et d'enfouissement technique, dont le premier a été ouvert donc, au nord d'Abidjan. Au nord d'Abidjan, nous avons donc un centre d'enfouissement. Et l'objectif de ce centre, c'est de rendre effectif l'économie circulaire à travers le biogaz et le compost. Donc voilà au niveau donc, des déchets. Voilà ce qu'on peut dire donc, pour cette deuxième question. Merci.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Minister, for your insight and expertise. I think your comments have given us, the audience and the panelists, a lot of food for thought. And it's been a pleasure to welcome you here today. And now I think we should be able to move on to our second poll of the session. And the question for our audience is, in your opinion, are the interests of Africa sufficiently taken into account during COPs? And the first option is yes, absolutely. Yes, rather. Not enough, not at all, and no opinion. And we'll get back to the results of those at the after our next key point. And I feel the question that we've just addressed to the audience is one that we should speak to our panelists about as well. So, you know, for the first time, COP is going to be held in Africa this year. And it feels like a real opportunity for Africa that disproportionately faces the brunt of climate change to action change. So, Key, maybe you could come in a step in here first as well. So, you know, how do you think we can make the upcoming COP in Cairo a success for African nations? And specifically, then, what do you think the role of Gabon will be at the meeting?
Thank you, Kanika. I think what it's important, it's a strong signal that the next COP will be held in Africa, on the African soil. When we look quickly at the demographic of it, the continent by 2050, the population of the continent will have doubled, and it will represent more than 25% of the global population. 40% of that population will be below the age of 14. And in some countries, the median age will be below 20. this is really to say that the challenges and the issues of Africa in terms of mitigation and adaptation are really the issues of the world. And it's really urgent that we address those issues to ensure that the developed world needs to show solidarity to the developing world, especially Africa, which is the continent that has less contributed to the problem, but is the one that is suffering the most from it. I think in terms of priorities and what we're expecting from this COP, it's really for the next COP to be the COP of implementation, to move from planning to implementation. And in terms of priority, I will just mention two of them. The first one is the Fund for Adaptation. COP26 provision and guided that this fund be doubled. And it's critical that this fund be made available to the developing countries, be made available, monitored, etc. But these funds has to be accessible. And the second one is the Finance for a Just Transition. Financial support is needed to finance sustainable development. And we need to support the developing world to move from a fossil fuel-based development model to a more sustainable one. And for that, we need to really have meaningful investment in those large-scale renewable energy projects, which in turn will support the equity and social dimension of a just transition pathway. That's second. Now, in terms of the role that Gabon will be playing during the next COP, it's the role that Gabon has been playing since Rio in 1992. Where we committed to remain a carbon sink. And that's what we've been doing so far. If you look at the past 15 years ago, you had a dozen countries that were carbon sink. Today, you only have a handful of them. Yeah. And it's really critical that we ensure that we create let's say, an economically viable pathway for those countries that have a large forest cover, like Gabon. 88% of the country is covered by forest. But today, there's no financial instrument available to capture that. Yeah. So we don't have any instrument to ensure that a tree standing has more value than a tree being cut. Yeah. So this is really our objective, what we're looking for to COP. We will restate our commitment to remain a carbon sink, and we're looking forward to the support of the parties to ensure that at the end of the day, we will be able to make this carbon credit issue a success. So that it's a success for the Congo Basin, it's a success for the continent, it's a success for the world, the rest of the world.
Yeah, it sounds like there's still quite a lot to do. And I mean, I hope that you guys are hopeful. I feel a little bit hopeful around this as well. Tariq, away from, specifics, I think, Akeem leveraged and he talked about Gabon's experience. So away from maybe specific issues of governments and countries, I mean, what commitments do you want to see from, I guess, both the public and the private sector? What should they be committing to at COP?
Yeah, I mean, as was said by Akeem, it's the target is to make it a COP of implementation, and many countries has been already committed to do a lot, and we are still waiting for support, financial support. I think we promise the 100 billion that is right now wasn't, implemented. So this is, it's not a lake of project, but of course a lake of what is considered bankable projects. So we have to work together, private and public and DFIs, in order to de-risk the project and answer to the need, which is huge. And on that, I think that the way it's clear, we have just to put our hands on and work on it, bring it the appropriate guarantee to the project, taking more risk from the private sector, looking to the other instruments we mentioned during this panel, and of course more support from DFIs in terms of bringing and building the appropriate legal and structuration of the project. So for me, this is the key elements.
Brilliant, Tarek. And Sergio, I know that I think you have to leave shortly, so it'll be great to bring you in here. I mean, what Tarek and Akeem both talked about is obviously this movement now from commitment to implementation. I mean, so how do we bring these commitments forward? How do we implement them? And what do you see your role, specifically at this COP, to signal to the world that this is where we're going?
I think, we all said, both Akeem, Tarek said that, this is going to be a COP of implementation. I think it's an interesting aspect that we do need all to focus now on what are the solutions and how do we really make them real. And I think the role that IFC and the World Bank Group in general, when we participate in COP27, is going to be that one, to try and bring to the table ideas, solutions, both examples of things that have been done, but also new proposals in terms of what can be done to really push the agenda forward. And we will be of course guided by our climate change action plan that has been put together by the World Bank Group. But on the IFC side, we'll be really focusing mostly on three themes, the important themes for us: adaptation and resilience, mobilizing climate finance, and energy access and decarbonization. I think these are the three themes that we will focus on, and we're looking forward to participating, contributing, and working with all the parties involved on finding the right solutions. And I agree that this is a very strong signal and a very strong message when COP is taking place on the African continent, and that will, I think, make us all focus even more on what's happening in Africa and how we can help Africa face the climate change challenges.
Perfect, great. Thank you, Sergio. It was a pleasure having you with us today. But on that note, Lena, I'd like to ask you the last question. So we've had the view from, I guess, a government view, a private sector view, the view from the DFIs. It'd be great to get kind of the view from the financial institutions. Obviously, are limited. I'm not asking you to speak on behalf of all of them, but how do you think that the financial sector can support Africa's ambitions and again, move that these commitments now to implementation in COP27 coming up?
So I think, Kanika, there are, I'll try to summarize this just in the interest of time in 3 points. Oh, that's fine, I understand. So three main points that I would like to kind of highlight. One is that the financial sector needs to get together and collaborate and identify different solutions in order to ensure that there is sufficient collaboration in order for all of us to kind of bring our efforts together, our financing power, but also our thought power and our brain power into innovating a lot of these structures. So that's one. And I think that's already happening with a lot of working groups, a lot of institutions and alliances that are getting together and coming up with ideas and solving issues as well. We at Standard Chartered are part of a lot of these, and we feel that contributing into these is kind of a real responsibility, but also a real opportunity. The second one is not use a one-size-fits-all scenario. We need tailor-made solutions for Africa, and we cannot rely on international taxonomies. We cannot rely on things being done in other places, which are sometimes not really applicable to the continent. So things like, for example, a proper transition finance framework or taxonomy that is applicable to the continent would be a lot more useful. The third one would be to innovate and promote new markets, such as the carbon markets that we were just talking about, but also through collaborative efforts, which is in my point one, to innovate around these structures, but also to get together and identify what are the obstacles, what are the mitigants, what do we need to have in place in order to ensure the integrity of these markets, ensure that we are mitigating greenwashing risks, and ensure that we are bringing Africa and its power of generating those carbon credits to the market for them to be able to kind of use that funding for even more sustainable projects. So innovating around these markets, innovating around structures. Again, not looking at it as a one-size-fits-all, even in terms of the structures, would be very important. So I'll just keep it for to that. There are more things, but I'm just going to keep it to those three main ones.
I think that's not the benefit, but this kind of discussion, there is so much more that we can discuss. But I think, talking about the innovation, tailor-made solutions, and the creation of new markets, I think that's a great note for us to finish our discussion of the key points on, because I think, again, it provides us with a lot to think about. But before we go on to our Q&A, which I think we will have a couple of minutes for, I think we've got the results of the second poll in. So the question was, and it'll be interesting to see if our audience shares my view of it being, being kind of a chance for Africa this time around. But so the question, in your opinion, are the interests of Africa sufficiently taken into account during the COPs? So leading with 66% of the vote is not enough. Then we have with 18% not at all, 10 yes to an extent. And then both with 3%, we have yes, absolutely, and those with no opinion. So not enough is kind of the standout answer there. So let's hope that something changes maybe this time around for us. I guess we'll see in the next couple of weeks or so. So I think we've got time now for a couple of questions. The first one that we have is from Christopher Kaczmarski, and he asks, what are the best options to attract private finance in climate adaptation investment that do not result in generating additional revenues? So I wonder, maybe Tarek, that might be a question for you, again, given that you've worked on both kind of the public and the private side. So what are the best options to attract private finance in climate adaptation investment that do not result in generating additional revenues? Did you get that?
Yeah, I mean, the line was good, wasn't good. I mean, I hear what is the best. Sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Of course, yeah. What are the best options to attract private finance in climate adaptation investment that do not result in generating additional revenues?
Yeah. Maybe the end of the sentence, I didn't understand what is meaning by that don't generate additional revenues.
Yeah, it's an interesting one.
Yeah, but maybe what is targeted here is, I mean, what is requested to attract finance, private finance on this field. I think, of course, we mentioned the certification and to give enough confidence on the project, on the green character of the project. So this is, I think, a process that takes time, requests some investment. So it has to be done properly with the appropriate advisors. And for that, as was mentioned by Sergio, I mean, a certain support from the FIs is needed in order to enhance and to qualify the project to get this this stamp and to benefit from such kind of financing. For me, this is the main challenge. So yeah, we need to work on it, and of course the know-how in this field is quite limited in Africa. So this is, I think, a very important point, because where I was implementing the first project, I think I was working with Mazen, and we issued the first green bond in Africa in 2016, of course. And right now, very few operation has been done in Africa, and one of the disadvantage is the fact that know-how. So here we need also the support in order to bring it.
Brilliant. Lena, I think you have something to add here as well.
Yeah, I think I agree with Tarek, but I think at the heart of this question is the bankability of a project, and it's a very difficult question. But at the same time, looking at the companies or the entities that are doing adaptation projects, will have other streams of income, for example. So just thinking off the top of my head, are there certain structures that we can create at a different level, for example, ring fencing certain revenues from other projects? Because at the end of the day, as a private finance provider, you would want to get repaid on your, you have stakeholders, you have shareholders, and therefore you kind of want to, as opposed to the type of organizations that would provide grants, this is a little bit different, and therefore you need to kind of come up with structures that make sense, and therefore that's where the innovation element needs to come in. We need to think about these a little bit more.
Great, thanks, Lina. That was a really concise answer, actually. This next question that we have. Sorry, I'm just trying to find the. So what is your view on the integration of the African continent to the European hydrogen market and the fallout of such projects on carbon markets and carbon credit revenues for African countries? So what's your view on the integration of the African continent into the European hydrogen market and the fallout of such projects on carbon markets and carbon credit revenues? So Tarek, I think this is...
Yeah, maybe I can take this one. I mean,
back to you.
Yeah. So we as Total are of course working on several countries. We have more than 3.5 gigawatt under operation and many projects under development, including green hydrogen projects in different countries, including Africa. So right now we have we are on development more than 3 big projects in Mauritania, Morocco, and Egypt, and we are also exploring other opportunities in Africa. And definitely Africa, especially for hydrogen, it's let's say paradise, because we can have a quite large area to develop wind and solar project, also hydro, and the resources are good, so we can produce green hydrogen, green ammonia with a quite competitive price. Of course, it's sustainable, and it can feed Europe. We have the proximity, especially for some countries like Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and Egypt. But also we can, of course, use shipping in order to bring this hydrogen. And the idea here is, of course, using the hydrogen to be exported, but not only, to bring and to add value on the countries by transforming it into and using it for the local industries. So big opportunity for Africa, first for its own development, but also for feeding the international market and European one, which is the most close.
Yeah. Hakeem, I don't know if you've got anything that you wanted to add either to the questions that we've heard or anything else to maybe, anything that we've not been able to address during the panel discussion. Oh.
I'm afraid to be keeping you for another hours. I think most of it has been said. Thank you very much, Kanika, for this opportunity.
Thanks, Hakeem. I think you kind of relayed all of our sentiments there. I think this is a discussion that could go on for hours more, and one, I guess, that we hope is brought up at COP, at the summit that we will be holding in Lomé later this year as well. But on that note, I'd like to thank all of our panelists, our expert speaker and our special guest, His Excellency 𝐩𝐿𝐵, for taking part in our webinar today. A recording of the panel should be made available early next week, I think, either on both the CEO Forum website and on YouTube. You'll just have to search for "How can climate finance expand electricity access in Africa?" So thanks everybody for joining us today, and I hope again that you can join us for our next webinar or for any of our upcoming events as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Everybody.
Bye.
I'm happier without you. Better now. I'm happier without you.